When the first transports of captured German soldiers were loaded onto U.S. Liberty ships bound for America, most of them believed the same thing. They wouldn't survive the trip. Propaganda inside the Reich had prepared them for cruelty. They were told that Americans treated prisoners like animals, that summary executions weren't punishable offenses, and that any German who surrendered was as good as dead. The men on those ships carried not only rifles and uniforms, but fear. Fear of the unknown, of defeat, of humiliation on foreign soil. Some whispered that the U.S. would use them for forced labor until they collapsed. Others expected beatings, starvation, or worse. Anything seemed possible in a world collapsing around them. Germany in 1944 was a landscape of ruins and rationing. Air raid sirens, bomb shelters, bread made from sawdust filler, and families who hadn't seen meat in months. Many POWs hadn't tasted sugar in years. And yet, when the hatches opened on the other side of the Atlantic, the world that greeted them contradicted everything they were told. The first shock wasn't luxury, it was normalcy. Clean uniforms, organized camps, running water, showers. But the cultural earthquake came in a cup, a cold one, Coca-Cola. For many German prisoners, the first sip felt like science fiction, a sugary, carbonated drink handed to them by the very nation they had been taught to hate. Some POWs later recalled that the taste was so strange it startled them. Others described it as the first time they realized America was not the enemy they imagined. And Coca-Cola wasn't the only revelation. In the summer months, mess halls in several American POW camps served a rare treat: ice cream. To German soldiers, men raised in a country rationing milk, fats, and sugar, the idea of prisoners eating ice cream bordered on the unbelievable. Not soldiers on leave, not civilians in safety. Prisoners, enemy prisoners. The dessert was more than food. It was insult, amazement, confusion, and relief in one frozen scoop. Some POWs reportedly cried. Others felt anger. A few refused it out of pride before curiosity overcame principle. Sitting behind barbed wire, eating ice cream, drinking a Coca-Cola, these were moments that rewired how thousands viewed the war. The same soldiers who survived Normandy, Anzio, or the Battle of the Bulge now found themselves in American camps with baseball games, educational programs, libraries, and food that felt luxurious compared to home. The shock didn't come from extravagance. America wasn't pampering them. It came from contrast. While German cities burned, while families froze through the brutal winter of 1944, while ration books shrank into rumor, their captured soldiers were tasting the cornerstones of American culture. For the first time, many realized something powerful and destabilizing. Germany told them America was weak, decadent, collapsing. But the Coca-Cola in their hand said otherwise. The ice cream in their bowl tasted like proof that the war wasn't just fought with tanks and rifles. It was fought with economies, industries, and abundance that Germany simply couldn't match. The POW camps, without meaning to, became a cultural battlefield, one where sugar and carbonation spoke louder than leaflets or speeches. And as the months passed, German POWs discovered that Coca-Cola and ice cream were only the beginning of how different the U.S. camps, and the country behind them, really were. To understand why German POWs were treated the way they were in American camps, you have to understand the mindset shaping U.S. policy in 1942 to 1945. The United States faced a war unlike anything in its history, a two-front conflict waged across oceans. Victory would require more than firepower. It would require demonstrating the strength of American ideology and industrial power. Washington knew the world was watching, and so were millions of captured enemy soldiers who would one day return home. The U.S. military command, backed by the Geneva Convention and a strategy for long-term stability, believed that how prisoners were treated would influence how American troops were treated in German captivity. Good treatment was not softness, it was strategy. If German POWs ate regularly, worked reasonable hours, and received medical care, the hope was that German officers in Europe and the Pacific might think twice before issuing brutal orders against Americans. But something else was at play. Optics. America understood that word of mouth was a weapon. Every POW who survived and returned to Europe would carry a story. And stories spread, faster than generals expected, deeper than propaganda could block. The United States wasn't just feeding prisoners, it was feeding information. The psychology worked both ways. Many German POWs had been raised on propaganda portraying America as a land of corruption, chaos, and racial violence. They expected to be starved, beaten, or worked to exhaustion. Instead, they found organized infrastructure, access to books, English language classes, sports leagues, orchestras, movie nights, and medical attention that was, in many cases, better than what civilian Germans had ever received. The Americans understood something Hitler never wanted them to see. Comfort is disarming. When a man is starving, he clings to ideology. When he's eating ice cream under a tree, ideology feels less urgent. Some POWs interpreted kindness as manipulation. Others felt guilt knowing their families rationed black bread while they drank Coca-Cola. But for many, especially younger prisoners, the experience cracked open a question. If the enemy treats us this well, how truthful were the stories we were told back home? Letters were censored but not silenced. Descriptions slipped through cautiously. Good food, fair guards, work, but not abuse. Some prisoners wrote that they had never eaten so well in their lives. Many believed, correctly, that telling the whole truth might prevent them from being welcomed back. The shock was not merely dietary, it was ideological. America was not a perfect nation, but Germany had painted it as apocalyptic. Yet behind barbed wire, POWs found a nation that had so much excess that it could afford to feed its enemies dessert. And that contrast, sugar-sweet and cold enough to sting the teeth, planted an idea more dangerous than any weapon, that the war Germany sold them was not the war Germany was losing. Coca-Cola and ice cream were not luxuries, they were symbols. Symbols of industry, of supply chains, of agricultural yield, of factories running day and night. Symbols that the United States could fight a global war and still have enough left over to indulge the men sent to kill them. And for the soldiers sitting in those camps, tasting both relief and confusion, one realization lingered long after the bowls and bottles were empty. Germany had asked them to die for a future that America seemed to already possess. The first letters that filtered back to Germany from POWs in the United States sounded so implausible that some families assumed their sons had been coerced, or worse, replaced by propaganda. Descriptions of fresh vegetables, meat, cigarettes, Coca-Cola, movies, and ice cream sounded less like war captivity and more like fiction. Germany was already deep into rationing by the early 1940s, and by 1944 the shortages had become desperate. Civilians lined for hours to receive bread stretched with fillers. Coffee became roasted grain. Butter became memory. Sugar was a luxury for the wealthy or the black market. And yet their captured soldiers were writing home that they had sweets and cold drinks in summer. The letters read like lies, until more arrived, all saying the same thing. Some mothers kept the letters hidden. Some reported them to local party leaders out of fear. Others dared to hope the rumors were true. The paradox was brutal. A soldier behind American barbed wire was sometimes safer, healthier, and better fed than his own family in Berlin, Hamburg, or Cologne. Culture shock did not end with food. For many German POWs, America was their first exposure to baseball, a game they couldn't understand but couldn't stop watching. They saw jazz bands perform inside camps, instruments donated by church groups and local charities. They watched movies, black and white comedies, westerns, musicals, projected on sheets hung against barracks. Some camps allowed educational programs where POWs studied English, engineering, agriculture, or literature. The idea that a prisoner could learn a trade, earn respect, and leave with more knowledge than he arrived with was unthinkable in the Reich, where dissent meant silence and scarcity meant control. And perhaps the most jarring revelation came quietly, through observation. German POWs saw integrated work units and black American soldiers performing roles that Nazi ideology declared impossible. Here was a society Germany had portrayed as racially fractured and collapsing, yet the food arrived, the machinery functioned, the economy roared, and the guards treated prisoners as men, not propaganda. Some POWs resisted these realizations, others debated them privately. A few, especially those raised on rigid ideology, felt betrayed by their own education. The longer some remained in captivity, the more complicated their feelings became. Not every camp was comfortable, and not every guard was kind, but the contrast to expectations was undeniable. A strange development emerged near the end of the war. Not all German POWs wanted to be repatriated when peace was declared. They feared returning to ruined homes, food shortages, political purges, and questions about loyalty. Some had formed relationships with local American families through work programs. Others developed attachments to the land or the stability. A minority even asked to remain permanently, requests rarely granted but deeply revealing. The war had taken everything from them, their sense of certainty, their trust in the government that raised them, and their understanding of the enemy they fought. What the camps exposed was simple, disarming, and devastating to ideology. Propaganda dissolves when lived experience contradicts it. Baseball games, ice cream, and Coca-Cola were small comforts, but they were also windows into a world that looked nothing like the posters that once hung in German schools. One sip of Coca-Cola did not end the war, but for thousands of POWs it ended the illusion that they understood it. Not all Americans agreed with the treatment German POWs received, and that tension became one of the least discussed conflicts of the war. For U.S. military command, fair treatment was strategy, morality, and Geneva Convention compliance. But for many American civilians, especially those who received telegrams with gold stars, it was personal. Mothers who lost sons in Normandy, brothers who never returned from Anzio, and widows raising children alone did not always appreciate seeing photographs of prisoners smiling at baseball games or working on farms. Some newspapers accused the government of pandering to the enemy, arguing that comfort should be earned, not provided. The War Department responded by restricting the release of images that displayed POW leisure activities. The reasoning was simple. The American public saw coffins draped with flags while their captured enemies saw ice cream machines in mess halls. But the truth remained. German prisoners were overall treated humanely because U.S. leadership believed that tomorrow's peace required today's restraint. Yet even within the camps, the hospitality had limits. POWs performed labor, farming, roadwork, canning, timber, which offset their cost of housing. They were required to follow strict rules, and escape attempts were not romantic adventures. Men were shot or wounded trying. There were fights, stabbings, ideological conflicts. Nazi loyalists threatened or assaulted fellow prisoners they deemed too friendly with Americans. The Americans often faced the difficult task of separating hardline officers from younger conscripts who were simply relieved to be alive. The camps were not resorts. They were controlled environments, structured and disciplined. But compared to bombed-out German cities, scarcity, fear, and chaotic retreats, they felt like another world. Then came the most jarring moment of the entire POW experience, the return home. As the war ended and prisoners were eventually transported back to Europe, many braced for celebration. They imagined reunions with grateful crowds or admiration for their survival. What they found was rubble, ration lines, and suspicion. In some villages, returning soldiers were viewed with resentment. "Why are you back when my son is not?" In others, they were greeted not as survivors but as reminders of failure. Germany was unrecognizable. Cities reduced to stone skeletons, infrastructure shattered, businesses gone, families displaced. And the strange twist was that some POWs returned with better nutrition and health than civilians who had stayed. Some German families saw their sons arrive heavier than they left because they had eaten regularly in American camps. Stories spread that contrasted sharply with Nazi propaganda. Many told of humane treatment, libraries, schools, food, and freedoms. And for some in Germany, these stories sounded like betrayal. They challenged the narrative that suffering for the Reich was noble. They suggested the enemy was not a monster. They hinted that the war had been sold under promises that reality did not deliver. The war reshaped everyone, but for German POWs, captivity became a catalyst for questioning ideology, leadership, loyalty, and truth. They had left a nation convinced of victory and returned to the aftermath of disaster. The taste of Coca-Cola and ice cream lingered not because they were sweet, but because they symbolized something they hadn't expected to find on the other side of the ocean, a future that looked different than the one their leaders promised them. For many German POWs, captivity in the United States became a dividing line in their lives. There was before, filled with propaganda, scarcity, and uncertainty, and after, shaped by unexpected exposure to American society. Once repatriated in 1946 to 47, thousands returned to shattered towns, burnt farms, and economies that operated on barter rather than currency. Food remained rationed into the 1950s. Entire neighborhoods of Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were piles of stone and rebar. Children played in ruins because there were no parks left. Factories had no equipment, stores had no products, families had no savings. Amid this devastation, former POWs carried memories, not of American cruelty, but of American abundance. They had seen tractors on farms while their own villages plowed with horses. They had eaten canned fruit and ice cream while their families ate boiled potatoes. They had watched movies projected indoors while their siblings sought shelter in basements and cellars. And because so many POWs had worked on U.S. farms, they returned with agricultural skills that helped reconstruct rural Germany. Some introduced techniques they learned in captivity: soil rotation, machinery use, crop storage, methods previously unseen in their villages. But the impact went beyond farming. Many prisoners came home speaking English, some fluently. Others returned with a very different view of the world and of democracy. They had witnessed debates in U.S. newspapers, free criticism of the government, something unimaginable in the Reich. They had been surrounded by wealth produced not through conquest, but industry. They saw citizens who questioned authority without vanishing. Not all embraced these revelations. Some rejected them out of pride or trauma. But the seeds were planted. Millions realized that power could be organized differently. As West Germany took shape, it was the generation returning from captivity, not those who remained isolated, who played a role in rebuilding administration, teaching, agriculture, and business. Even decades later, when historians interviewed former POWs, many recalled their shock not at being imprisoned, but at being treated as human beings in the midst of a global war. There is a lesser-known chapter to this story. Some POWs returned to America voluntarily, decades later, as immigrants. By the 1950s and 1960s, a number of former German prisoners sought visas, returned to the towns where they once worked fields under guard, and restarted their lives there. They married, farmed, opened shops, or raised families in places where they once shoveled grain or cut timber wearing numbered tags. In some towns, reunions were organized between former guards and former prisoners, events that baffled those who still viewed war in absolutes. One man, interviewed in the 1980s, described it this way: "I came to fight Americans. I left believing my children would be safer growing up among them." It was not a universal sentiment. War is too complicated for unanimous conclusions. But it was real, recorded, and repeated often enough to be more than anecdote. In the end, the story of German POWs in America is not about dessert or Coca-Cola or baseball. Those were symbols, not solutions. The real impact lay in exposure. Exposure to systems, freedoms, debates, and industries that challenged assumptions. America did not win the war with ice cream, but for some POWs, that first cold spoonful behind barbed wire was the moment they realized the war was not what they were told it was. And that realization traveled back across the Atlantic long after the gates of the camps closed. The legacy is complicated but undeniably significant. When German POWs returned to their homeland, many carried with them stories that challenged stereotypes and reshaped expectations. These stories influenced political attitudes, agricultural practices, and cultural perceptions of the United States. Some Germans later credited captivity, a paradox, with opening their eyes to ideas that helped rebuild their country. Others felt guilt, confusion, or resentment, and some rejected the narrative entirely, pointing to the trauma of war, separation, and identity crisis. For America, the camps remain a historical footnote overshadowed by battles, heroes, and tragedies. But in the micro-history of individuals, the impact was profound. A bottle of Coca-Cola or a scoop of ice cream is trivial in peacetime, but in wartime it becomes a symbol of industrial capacity, of morale, of choices made when bullets are still flying. It remains one of the strangest contrasts of the Second World War, that while soldiers clashed on foreign soil, captured enemies tasted the sweetness of the society they were told to destroy. And when the war ended, that memory, cold, fizzy, improbable, lingered. In the end, the story of German POWs in America isn't about desert. It's about the power of perception versus reality. It's about how nations imagine each other, how propaganda shapes enemies, and how first-hand experience can dismantle even the tallest myths. The men who sat beneath guard towers eating ice cream and drinking Coca-Cola became living evidence that war is never as simple as the posters make it. Some returned home determined never to fight again. Some returned with gratitude. Some returned conflicted. But they returned with knowledge. Knowledge that no leaflet, speech, or headline could have delivered. That their enemy was not a caricature, not a monster, but a country defined by abundance, confidence, and contradiction. A country that could fight across the globe and still have enough left to hand dessert to its prisoners. And in the telling of that story, long after the barbed wire rusted away, one truth endures. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not fear. It's what happens when the enemy sits down, takes a bite, and tastes a different future.